Good afternoon, everyone, once again, and I'm very, very sorry for the technical difficulties we've been experiencing. I hope you're able to stay with us. We're going to start all over again because we think it's very important that you don't miss out on any parts of this webinar. So, as you know, I'm Sarah Breslin from the ECML, and together with my colleague, Professor David Little, we're going to be delivering this second webinar on the Council of Europe's recommendation on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. I'm going to say just a few words to begin on the Council of Europe itself and on why it decided it was important to develop this recommendation. And then David will look at the what, the why and the how of plurilingual education. So if you just give me one moment to share my screen. And to go back because the slides have moved forward. Here we go, take two. Okay, so the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is Europe's oldest political institution, intergovernmental institution, focusing on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It covers 46 member states and 7 million people in Europe. And all of those people have signed all of those countries have signed the European Convention of Human Rights. It aims to promote human rights, democracy, and rule of law in a number of different ways, through conventions, through charters, for example, the Charter on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, or the Convention on Cybercrime, and also through recommendations, which are not legally binding, but once adopted, ministers of foreign affairs do commit to their implementation. And it also works through capacity building programs, many of them in the field of education itself. Sometimes it's easy to confuse the European institutions. The Council of Europe is not the European Council. The European Council is the decision-making body of the European Union. The European Union has 27 member states, and no country has ever joined the EU without first being a member of the Council of Europe. So two different organisations, but ones that work very closely together. So the Committee of Ministers is the decision-making body of the Council of Europe, and on the 2nd of February this year, it adopted the recommendation in the field of language education, the recommendation on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. Of course, before it reached the Committee of Ministers, the recommendation went through a long development process. There was a working group and a drafting group. Both David and I were involved in the drafting, and it was then negotiated through the Education Steering Committee in Strasbourg and the governing board of the ECML. And this allowed us to take on board countries' concerns and their feedback and to come up in the end with a text that countries were happy with. I think in that sense, it's a very good example of successful multilateralism. So now the time has come to actually take the recommendation seriously and begin the hard work of putting it into implementation. Why a new recommendation? What's the point and why now? Well, the Council of Europe does develop new recommendations when it recognises some common European challenge and decides that a policy instrument will not only put this problem on the political agenda, but will also provide impetus for working towards solving the problem. So what problem or problems are we talking about? Let's take a quick look at the rationale. The rationale addresses two specific developments that the Council of Europe is concerned about: the domination of English to the detriment of other languages, and this notion that minority or migrant languages might in some way harm societal cohesion. These, of course, are two big challenges, and they are all part of an even bigger one, which is the backsliding of democracy. So what can we do to both improve the quality of language education and in turn improve our democracies? Here in the rationale, I've repeated the title of the recommendation because this in fact puts a positive spin. This shows us that if we can really implement plurilingual and intercultural education, then we can strengthen our democratic cultures. And so now I'm going to ask my colleague David Little to look at the detail of what we mean by plurilingual and intercultural education. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Sarah has just said, my topic this afternoon is threefold. What is plurilingual and intercultural education? Why do we think it's important? Why should we be attempting to implement it? And how do we go about it? But first, some preliminary considerations. Considerations in relation to recommendation 2002-1. The concept of plurilingual and intercultural education has implications for the whole of educational culture. And that means that it poses major challenges to all educational agents and stakeholders. As paragraph 5 of the appendix to the recommendation acknowledges, the full implementation of the measures proposed is the work of many years and entails shifts not only in education policies and practices, but in societal attitudes to linguistic and cultural diversity. On the other hand, the Council of Europe has long been committed to plurilingualism and plurilingual approaches to education generally, and language education in particular. The Council of Europe has also long been committed to the development of intercultural awareness and intercultural competences, and it's long been committed to education for democratic citizenship. To this extent, there's nothing new in the recommendation. Everything it proposes can be found in existing Council of Europe policy documents and instruments. And everything it proposes is supported by a wide range of ECML projects, present and past. The purpose of the recommendation is to use the holistic concept of plurilingual and intercultural education to remind member states of long-established aspirations and give those aspirations new impetus. Paragraph 1A of the recommendation states that the measures set out in the appendix should be implemented taking due account of national, regional, and/or local circumstances and in conformity with constitutional provisions, which means, of course, that implementation should always be context sensitive. What's more, plurilingual and intercultural education will come in many different shapes and sizes. While recognizing, as we've already seen, that full implementation of the measures is the work of many years, the recommendation also states much can nevertheless be achieved in the meantime by adjusting policy and practice at the level of the educational institution and the classroom, and by drawing on existing Council of Europe resources. This paradox reminds us that educational progress is most efficient when the evolution of policy is informed by successful practice, when general principles are tested against the realities of lived educational experience, when the daily realities of school and classroom, college and lecture hall or seminar room engage critically with the principles that shape policy. And this paradox is fundamental to the structure of what's going to follow. This is how I shall answer the three questions in my title. Question one, what is plurilingual and intercultural education? I shall answer by elaborating on the definition provided by the recommendation. Question two, why should we promote plurilingual and intercultural education? I shall answer with reference to the underlying principles set out in the recommendation, elaborating them by drawing especially on the explanatory memorandum that accompanies the recommendation. And those two sets of answers are, of course, as it were, top-down. They're addressing the overarching concept from the level of national or regional policy. When it comes to the third question, how do we develop and implement plurilingual and intercultural education? It's necessary to be specific because, as I've already said, plurilingual and intercultural education is not a one-size-fits-all proposition. And I shall use an example from Ireland to illustrate what has already been possible in one educational context. First of all, then, what is plurilingual and intercultural education? Here's the definition provided by the recommendation. Let me take you through it, elaborating on it bit by bit. Plurilingual and intercultural education aims at the development of integrated linguistic repertoires in which languages interrelate and interact. That phrase is a deliberate echo of Section 3 of the first chapter of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which defines plurilingualism as a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and in which languages interrelate and interact. An integrated repertoire includes all the languages the individual uses at whatever level of proficiency and however those languages have been learned. Plurilingual and intercultural education takes account of the languages and cultures that learners bring with them, including sign minority and migrant languages and cultures. The CEFR's action-oriented approach to the definition of proficiency views language users and learners as social agents, members of society who have tasks, not exclusively language-related, to accomplish in a given set of circumstances. In other words, learners of all ages, even very young learners, are not blank slates. They already have a linguistic and cultural repertoire. Plurilingual and intercultural education takes account of the languages of schooling, which vary in genre and terminology according to the different subjects taught, and differ in significant ways from the language of informal, everyday communication. The concept of plurilingualism embraces different varieties of the same language, as well as multiple languages. Now, in many countries, migrant learners already have plurilingual repertoires, but plurilingual and intercultural education is for everyone, and teachers of all subjects have a stake in it. Plurilingual and intercultural education takes account of regional, minority, and other languages and cultures that are part of the curriculum, and of foreign languages, modern and classical. That's to say that plurilingual and intercultural education seeks to teach the second or foreign languages of the curriculum in ways that embed them in learners developing plurilingual repertoires. And this implies pedagogically a central role for target language use, not necessarily slavishly excluding the use of all other languages, but supporting the use of the target language by drawing on the whole linguistic resources of all members of the group, the class. Plurilingual and intercultural education, besides taking account of all these languages, seeks to bring them into interaction with one another. Now, the interaction between languages in the learner's plurilingual mind facilitates the interaction between languages in communication and in teaching learning, and vice versa. Finally, plurilingual and intercultural education takes account of other languages and cultures that are not present in school and not part of the curriculum. Plurilingual and intercultural education creates awareness of languages and cultures in society at large. Why should we promote plurilingual and intercultural education? Here are the 7 underlying principles set out in paragraph 4 of the appendix to the recommendation. Principle 1, plurilingual and intercultural education is essential to education for democratic culture. As the explanatory memorandum says, education prepares the individual to be an active participant in democratic society by promoting his or her personal development, combining social responsibility with growing self-awareness, self-confidence, independence of thought, and critical cultural and language awareness. Principle 2, plurilingual and intercultural education respects and values linguistic and cultural diversity. The European Cultural Convention of 1954 aims to achieve a greater unity between its members for the purpose, among others, of safeguarding and realizing the ideals and principles which are their common heritage. And the Council of Europe White Paper on Intercultural Dialogue of 2008 defines integration as a two-way process that requires an active response on the part of majority as well as minority communities. Plurilingual and intercultural education supports this political agenda by respecting and valuing linguistic and cultural diversity. Principle 3 and Principle 4, plurilingual and intercultural education promotes language awareness and language sensitivity across the curriculum and encourages critical reflection on cultural diversity. When the languages available to learners, together with whatever cultural experiences are attached to them, are drawn into the educational process, all learners are helped to develop critical language awareness and intercultural competence. With the development of integrated plurilingual repertoires in mind, all teachers are responsible for helping their learners to understand and master the academic language specific to their subject. Principle 5, plurilingual and intercultural education helps to foster critical digital literacy and digital citizenship. as an increasingly important part of everyday linguistic reality, communication via digital media should play a central role in plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. Digital citizenship and engagement involve a wide range of activities, from creating, consuming, sharing, playing, and socializing, to investigating, communicating, learning, and working. And all of those, are, of course, are relevant in educational experience. Principle 6, plurilingual and intercultural education encourages learner autonomy and values the learner's voice. The Council of Europe first introduced the concept of learner autonomy to language education via Henri Olek's 1979 report, Autonomy and Foreign Language Learning. The autonomization of learners was seen as an essential dimension of democratic education. Two quotations from the explanatory memorandum. Giving pupils and students a voice in the educational process is a way of developing their capacity for autonomous learning and critical thinking, and thus preparing them for lifelong learning and active participation in the democratic process. Making space for pupils and students' voice means requiring them to share responsibility for the teaching learning process and involving them in the organization of extracurricular activities. Finally, Principle 7, plurilingual and intercultural education supports the inclusion of disadvantaged and marginalized learners on an equal footing with other learners. Because it values and draws on the linguistic and cultural resources of all pupils and students, plurilingual and intercultural education supports the full inclusion of those from disadvantaged and marginalized situations. I can sum up these first two parts of my presentation by referring to the reference framework of competencies for democratic culture, because it should be clear from what I've said that plurilingual and intercultural education helps to develop the competencies needed for democratic citizenship. The reference framework summarizes those competences in this graphic, dividing them into values, attitudes, knowledge and critical understanding, and skills. Plurilingual and intercultural education develops learners' linguistic, communicative, and plurilingual skills. It also develops their knowledge and critical understanding of language and communication. In doing these things, it fosters openness to cultural difference. And it helps learners to come to value cultural diversity. So much for what it is and why we should want to make it happen. But how does it happen? Now, as I've said, I descend to the level of one particular institution. And before I begin this third part of my talk, I acknowledge my thanks to my collaborator in research, Deirdre Kerwin, who for almost 30 years was principal of the school that I'm going to talk about. Here it is, Scolrigia Calini, St. Bridget's School for Girls, Blanchardstown, which is one of Dublin's western suburbs. And the data that I'm going to share with you on the screen in a moment refers to the school year 2014-15, which was the last year in which Deirdre Kerwin was principal before she retired. In that year, the school had 320 pupils, ranging in age from 4.5 upwards to 12.5 upwards. 80% of them came from immigrant families. Most of the 80% had little or no English when they started school, and between them they had 51 home languages other than English, most of those languages unknown to the teachers. And here they are in alphabetical order as reported to the principal by pupils' parents when they enrolled their daughters. A few of these languages are represented in most classes in the school. Polish would be the biggest example of that. Another example with a lot of pupils representing in the representative levels of the school would be Tagalog, because the hospital in the school's catchment area employs a lot of staff from the Philippines. But most of these languages are represented by a single family, 2 or 3 daughters, or a single pupil. This clearly poses a major educational challenge. Before I explain how the school went about responding to that challenge, let me offer a little contextual information. Irish is the first and English the second official language of Ireland. That explains why Irish is an obligatory subject from the beginning to the end of schooling, even though it's the first or home or preferred language of only a small minority of the population. There's been a steady increase in immigration to Ireland since the 1990s. Between the censuses of 1996 and 2016, the population grew by 31%. And Ireland is now irreversibly a linguistically and culturally diverse society. The challenge faced by Scoilride is not a transient phenomenon, it's here to stay. In Ireland, we have 8 years of primary school. There are 2 preparatory years that we call junior and senior infants, and they correspond to preschool, kindergarten, and so on in other countries. And then we have 6 primary grades, which we call classes: 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th class. In Ireland, we have an excellent child-centered primary school curriculum. A curriculum whose aim is that pupils should realize their full potential as unique individuals. A curriculum that asserts that the child's existing knowledge and experience form the basis for learning, that the child is an active agent in his or her learning, and a curriculum that emphasizes the importance of the life of the home. It declares that parents during the primary years are the child's principal educators. Clearly, this is an important consideration when the language of the home is not a version of the language of schooling. We can summarize Scoilride's version of the plurilingual approach as it existed in 2015 by setting out these 4 basic pedagogical principles. First, plurilingual pupils will learn most effectively if they're encouraged to use all the languages at their disposal whenever they want to, and for whatever purposes seem to them appropriate. Now, this principle presupposes that pupils have fully integrated language repertoires and that each language in that repertoire is available to them for immediate spontaneous use within the limits of their proficiency. How those languages interrelate and interact, to quote the CFR again, how those languages interrelate and interact in pupils' minds is unknown and unknowable. Principle 2, even very young children can be trusted to know how to use their home language as a tool of learning. This principle arises from the fact that the pupil's home language is her principal cognitive tool. It's the medium of her discursive thinking and of her consciousness. And these functions of the pupil's home language explain why it would be cruel, misguided, and vain to forbid her to use that language at school. Principle 3, teaching and learning proceed via exploratory dialogue. Pupils share the initiative in classroom discourse. This principle coincides with the expectations of the primary school curriculum, though it doesn't shape teaching in all primary schools. Clearly, if pupils are to use their home language in the classroom, they must be allowed to share control of classroom discourse. The combination of home language use and discourse control is expected to promote pupils' self-confidence and self-efficacy. And principle 4, a strong emphasis on the development of literacy skills in English, Irish, French, and home languages. And of course, the development of literacy in home languages implies the involvement of immigrant parents. This principle complements principle 3. Reading and writing are in balance with listening and speaking. The development of literacy skills supports the development of oral skills and vice versa. Skolrige's goal is to develop pupils' writing skills to the highest levels of age-appropriate proficiency in all the languages in their developing plurilingual repertoires. So, how did this approach work out in the classroom? First, it's important to identify the 3 functions that home languages came to play in the life of the classroom, in classroom discourse. First of all, they were used in reciprocal communication between pupils with the same or a closely related home language. In the period of play at the beginning of the school year, as the school day in junior infants, for example, pupils quickly worked out who spoke their language and began conversations. And this kind of communication was continued in the schoolyard during break times at all levels of the school. It was also used in pair and group work in the classroom. Pupils with the same or a closely related home language could work together on a problem or a project, though at the end, of course, they had to report back to their peers and the teacher in English. Home languages could also be used for non-reciprocal purposes of display. This is what we say in my language. In the most junior classes, learning to count, working with shapes and colors, and action games were all multilingual activities carried out in English and Irish, and in all the home languages present in a particular class. For example, pupils were taught to count from 1 to 10 in English, and then in Irish, and then each pupil taught the rest of the class how to count from 1 to 10 in his or her home language. Sometimes they had to get that from their parents, of course. And this use of home languages scaffolded the learning of English and Irish, and also the learning of curriculum content. Thirdly, home languages served as a source of intuitive linguistic knowledge that individual pupils made available to the teacher and the rest of the class through their initiatives in classroom communication. And this greatly enriched curriculum content and consolidated curriculum learning. One of its most obvious impacts was the development of unusually high levels of language awareness in pupils. For example, in third class, pupils are introduced to fractions in their maths lessons. One teacher did this by writing the word fraction on the whiteboard and associating it with fracture and eliciting synonyms, break, split, but also words for break in other languages. A Romanian pupil offered rupt, which pupils quickly linked to the eruption of a volcano, interruption, and disruption. This language awareness also shows itself in the impact of cross-linguistic comparison on pupils' English vocabulary. In a maths lesson in fourth class, the teacher asked, "What's an oblique line?" A Romanian pupil suggested it was like oblique in her language, which meant something you must do. The teacher explained the difference between oblique and oblige. An Irish pupil noted that obligatory is like Romanian oblique. A Filipino pupil offered obligate. A Lithuanian pupil then answered the teacher's original question. There's an oblique line on the end of the letter Q, though not in the font I'm using for this presentation. For me, the outstanding achievement of Skolvrige's plurilingual approach is the development of plurilingual literacy. The development of literacy, after all, is what education is all about at every level. In some sense, achievement is always a matter of literacy. And what Skolvrige managed to do was to develop age-appropriate literate proficiency in all pupils. This began in senior infants, when teachers provided worksheets that could be completed in English and Irish or home languages. And it continued in first class when pupils produced simple identity texts in English and their home language. Here are two examples. On the left, the teacher has provided the pupil with a sheet of paper with just 4 lines ruled on it. And the teacher has then written on the whiteboard, "My school is Skolvrige, my teacher is Miss K." The pupils copied those 2 sentences and then drawn a picture of Miss K and of herself flying a kite. She's then taken the worksheet home, and one of her parents has shown her how to write those 2 sentences in the home language, which is Polish. On the right, a pupil in first class produces this text in English and Russian. "I'm 7 years old, I'm from Latvia, and my town is called Riga. I love to wear a cap." And then she writes not exactly an equivalent, but a sort of continuation. The important thing to say about this text is that it was written during class without any assistance. Teacher couldn't help with the Russian, but wasn't required either to help with the English. In second class and third class, dual language texts became more elaborate, and in third class, some pupils began to write texts in English, Irish, and their home language. The story behind this example is as follows. In the news section, which begins each school day, one pupil told the story of an accident that she'd had in the park that involved calling an ambulance. And so in the Irish lesson, a little later in the morning, the teacher used this story as the basis for having the class together write an account of it in Irish. As the pupils called out sentence after sentence, the teacher wrote the evolving story on the whiteboard, correcting errors without comment. And all the pupils copied from the whiteboard into their copybooks. And then for homework, their task was to reinforce their learning of Irish, of course, by producing an English equivalent. And that you can see on the right of the screen. But this pupil also produced a version of the story in her own language, Hungarian. In fourth class, a Romanian pupil filled 6 pages of her copybook with a story in English in which several of the characters speak Romanian. In fifth class, French was added to English, Irish, and home languages, but it was learnt by using it as an alternative medium for exploring curriculum themes. There would be one French lesson each week in which the teacher introduced the new words, idioms, phrases, whatever, that she was going then to build into parts of her, as it were, mainstream curriculum teaching later in the week. Here are 2 examples of drawings and texts produced by pupils in a project on my house, my home, where I live. In both cases, the first text is Irish. The second text is French. Then there's the home language text, Malayalam on the left, Tagalog on the right, and finally, a bit of text in English. In 6th class, pupils engaged in sophisticated language play, and they wrote confidently in English, Irish, French, and their home language. Here's my favorite example, which comes from the 6th class fashion show. When they were nearly at the end of their time in the school, one 6th class said to their teacher, "Can we put on a fashion show? We'll organize it, but we'll invite our parents and our grandparents to come and see it." And the teacher was very glad to have them take over and absorb a lot of time because she'd come to the end of the official curriculum with them. So she said, "Yes, you can do that, but there are 2 conditions. First, as you're designing the fashion show, you must make sure that you include all the languages that we have. So English, Irish, French, and all your home languages. They must all be used in the fashion show, but try to make sure that you use them in ways that make it possible for members of the audience who don't know those languages to guess what you're talking about." And the second thing you must do is invent a model. Give her a name and write a little text about her. Here's the example of Marceline. "My name is Marceline. I'm 15 years old. But remember, this pupil was 12. I'm 15 years old. I'm in Hollystar High. I'm not that girly. I do a lot of sports. My favorite's basketball. I have many trophies from basketball. I really like the color blue and aqua. Don't you think it's beautiful? I really love my friends. I always go shopping with them and go skateboarding with them. Here is a small part of my story. Enjoy." And then we get the same thing in Irish. And I should tell you that when I used this example several years ago in a talk at an international conference, a colleague from the Irish department in another Irish university said to me, you know, we'd be very happy if all 18-year-olds coming to take a degree course in Irish could write the language with that degree of confidence, fluency, and accuracy. And then we have a text in French. Now, it's a bit shorter, but remember, by this time, this pupil has been learning French for only just about 18 months. Je m'appelle Marceline, j'ai 15 ans, je vais à l'école Hollister High. J'aime le sport, j'adore le basket. J'ai gagné beaucoup de, and she didn't know the word for trophies. J'adore les couleurs bleues et aqua, j'adore mes amis, je fais le magasin toujours, je vais avec mon ami, amusez-vous bien. And then the icing on the cake is the home language, which, as you can see, is Mandarin. This pupil almost certainly attended the weekend school organized by the Chinese community to teach reading and writing in Chinese to the children. There were three bonuses that arose from this plurilingual education. First of all, Skolrija's version of plurilingual and intercultural education had a positive impact on the learning of Irish. Native-born Irish pupils were motivated to think of Irish as their home language, and that greatly increased their motivation to learn and their readiness to speak and write. Because all pupils first encountered Irish when they started school, the language acted as a sort of bridge, what we've called elsewhere a second language glue between English and minority language pupils' home languages. From an early age, pupils were motivated to engage in ambitious, autonomous learning projects. And the use of home languages fostered pupils' self-esteem. Keywords in pupils' responses to the question, what are the benefits of using your home languages in school, were these: possibilities, advantage, exploring, yes. Personal, friendship, knowledge, expanding, closer, warm, spark, point of view, perspective, together, help, learn, supports, great, speak out, be courageous. And all of those words and phrases point to concepts which in turn point to competences set out in the reference framework I referred to at the end of the second part. It's worth saying something about overall learning achievement. Thanks to the strong emphasis on writing, all pupils developed high levels of age-appropriate literacy in English, Irish, and French. Pupils' achievement in Irish was unusual for its range, confidence, and fluency. Think back to the example of Marceline. Skolrija was ranked in the top 12% of primary schools for achievement in Irish. Pupils from immigrant families also developed age-appropriate literacy in their home language. Because multiple languages were continuously in focus, pupils acquired unusually high levels of metalinguistic awareness. And in the standardized tests that pupils took each year, tests of reading and maths, from first class to sixth class, the school performed consistently above the national average. But bear in mind, what I've been sharing with you is the result of 20 years of continuous development. Skolrija enrolled its first immigrant pupils in the mid-1990s. The number of pupils from immigrant families grew steadily from the late 1990s to 2014-15. The approach I've described was the result of continuous development in an infinite succession of small steps. To begin with, activities involving home languages were piloted by a small group of more experienced teachers. Gradually, other teachers joined in as they witnessed the positive impact of these activities. By 2014-15, the approach applied to the whole school and was enshrined in a school language policy, which is printed as an appendix to the book-length case study that Deirdre Kerwin and I published in 2019. What about the impact of Council of Europe principles, policy, values on the development of this plurilingual and intercultural approach? The original decision to include home languages in pupils' educational experience was motivated by two concerns: that immigrant pupils should not lose their home languages. In the 19th century, education in Ireland was compulsorily through English, and that had a major impact on the continuation of the language as an instrument of daily communication in the majority population. The second concern, that a one-language-only policy would impact negatively on social cohesion in the school. Now, in the early 2000s, there was a curriculum framework for English as an additional language, English for pupils whose home language is not English, and that was based on the first three levels of the CFR and went together with a version of the European language portfolio. And those two instruments introduced teachers and pupils to key Council of Europe concepts, notably learner autonomy. But although Skolvrige's approach coincides closely with what the recommendation proposes, those original two concerns at the top of the screen are entirely harmonious with Council of Europe values, with the kinds of things one derives when one applies the European Convention on Human Rights to education. Although the approach coincides then with what the recommendation proposes, Council of Europe concepts have played a much greater role in describing and analysing the approach than in developing it. And we do that fairly systematically in the book I've already referred to. The experience and example of Skolvrige and of other schools working in the same direction, together with reflection on the recommendation and its explanatory memorandum, should help other schools to develop their own version of the plurilingual and intercultural approach in much less than 20 years. Let me briefly conclude. I began by pointing out that the concept of plurilingual and intercultural education has profound implications for education at all levels. I noted that the activities recommended to member states imply a process of reform that's likely to last for many years. But I also insisted that much can be achieved now at the level of the educational institution. I answered my first question, what is plurilingual and intercultural education, by elaborating on the definition provided by the recommendation. I answered my second question, why should we want to promote plurilingual and intercultural education, by referring to the 7 underlying principles set out in the recommendation. And I replied to my third question, the how of plurilingual and intercultural education, with reference to the example of Skolvrige Kalini. A final word. As I also said at the beginning of my talk, educational progress is most efficient when the evolution of policy is informed by successful practice, when general principles are tested against the realities of lived educational experience, when the daily realities of school and classroom, college and lecture hall or seminar room engage critically with the principles that shape policy. As this webinar was designed to show, Recommendation 2022-1 and its explanatory memorandum can be used in two complementary ways: to stimulate and guide the development of policy and practice at national level, which is a complex and long-term process that in principle includes all sectors and levels of education, and to analyse current policy and practice, especially at institutional level, with a view to undertaking local reform and development and discovering what plurilingual and intercultural education means for learners in classrooms, lecture halls, and seminar rooms. Without the top-down and bottom-up processes implied by these two uses, the recommendation is, I think, unlikely to have the impact that the Council of Europe intends. If there aren't examples of local initiative similar to Skalvija Kailini, but tailored to the needs of the local context, if there aren't those, then the top-down efforts at implementation will lack grassroots support. On the other hand, if there isn't that kind of top-down policy development or redevelopment with a determined effort at implementation, then local examples such as Skalvija Kailini may well in turn shrivel up for lack of national support. Because if you depend only on the institution, you depend very much on the personnel of that institution at the moment of implementation, and personnel changes over time. That, you'll be glad to know, ladies and gentlemen, is everything I have to say. So I will stop here and hand back to Sarah. Thank you very much. Sarah, you're muted.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David. That was a very, very rich and insightful presentation, and I think very inspirational. And I really hope that everyone listening is going away full of ideas now of how to begin the journey towards implementing plurilingual and intercultural education. I don't think we have any questions in the YouTube channel, possibly because of the delay in starting this webinar with the technical problems we had. But I would just like to apologise once again for those technical problems, and particularly to our listeners through the French channel. We had particular difficulties with the interpretation, the technical side of things, but we really did want this to be a webinar delivered both in English and French in the true spirit of plurilingualism. And before I finish, I would just like to add a couple of slides to David's, and I promise you, be very, very quick. This was one of David's final remarks, this need for both top-down and bottom-up processes. And of course, that is absolutely the case. And it is a recommendation to member states with the expectation that the changes need to take place within the different countries. But that doesn't mean that the Council of Europe has no responsibility to support this process. In fact, completely the opposite. We, particularly here at the ECML and together with our colleagues in Strasbourg, are working very hard to provide you with additional resources and access to training, events, etc., which can help you bring together the top-down and the bottom-up process. And I would just like to finish by pointing out one or two of these resources. And I'm going to do it by showing you briefly the structure of the Council of Europe recommendation. Why am I doing that? First of all, just to help you get your head around it if it's a text that you haven't already engaged with, but also because if you take a look at the webinar from June, which is on our website, you'll find ideas drawing on excerpts from these different parts of the main text and the explanatory memorandum, and how you can use these as a starting point for discussion, for thinking about what plurilingual and intercultural education may look like in your particular context. So please look at that. And the second reason I wanted to mention the structure was, of course, because of the explanatory memorandum. David has referred to it many times, but this is a text which is rich in hyperlinks, linking you to Council of Europe instruments and material, again designed to help you in the challenge of implementing plurilingual and intercultural education. For example, there are resources for developing or reviewing your language policies, for supporting the language of schooling, for promoting home languages, and for looking at the kind of competences language teachers need to address the current challenges. A real wealth of resources, so please do dig into the explanatory memorandum. And finally, just to say to you that this is a series of webinars. So we've now completed the first and the second. There will be a third webinar between New Year and the end of March, where the focus will be on teacher education, and then another one before the summer focusing on societal engagement. And we will make sure that the information is disseminated through all of our communication channels. So once again, I would like to say a huge thank you to David Little, and thank you to all of you listening. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. And I really hope that you're going off for the weekend full of ideas about how to implement plurilingual and intercultural education. So from all of us here at the ECML and from David in Dublin, goodbye.
Goodbye.